lovers of lore, thank you for joining me for this Magic the Gathering lore. We're going to be talking about the story Foulmere, which comes from the old novel Distant Plains. And this is a story that basically focuses on what it's like to be an everyday individual whose life is upended by planeswalkers. So we're going to be viewing the world through the eyes of the naturalist, who was at one point an actual professor with a very distinguished career. But now, Dr. Peter Langwind instead resides in a shack in the brush of the fens of Foulmere. He left his career for a number of reasons, commercial exploitation of nature being chief amongst them. And now he spends his time devoted to living in Foulmere, learning everything he can about its inhabitants and helping to maintain the balance of the environment. He managed to actually befriend the primitive, stealthy descendants of Havenwood. They're essentially wood gnome people, and they've made Foulmere their home. They are the spiritual caretakers of Foulmere. They're known as the Yublut. The naturalist had lived in this shack for many years, and from time to time, a planeswalker would appear unbidden. So the naturalist wasn't much surprised, but was very disappointed when an unknown visitor with the aid of magical enchantments managed to elude the Yublut and arrived at his shack. Now, the naturalist wanted none of it, but he knew how planeswalkers were. This one strutted about, clearly quite arrogant, dressed as a merchant, with a cute little cat accompanying him. The planeswalker made a pretense of being a merchant, but Langwind saw straight through it and said, "I know what you are." This caused the planeswalker to preen. "Most mortals aren't able to see through my guise. You are Dr. Peter Langwind. I learned of you in the land of Akkad." It turned out that one of the naturalist's former colleagues had mentioned his name as a repository of vast and obscure learning. Peter cursed that colleague in his mind. He had absolutely no desire to help any planeswalker and wondered why he was even speaking to this one when it dawned on him that there must be some charm at work causing him to be more open in conversation. The planeswalker points out, "Clearly you know what I'm capable of, so you know that you have no choice in whether you're going to help me or not." The naturalist grumbles his agreement, and the planeswalker reveals himself as Vram, and the cat is actually his familiar that goes by the name of Mao. Now, because the naturalist was aware that Vram was using magic on him, he decided that he would ramble on about all the different life forms in the swamp as a way to keep Vram distracted. The naturalist's biggest fear was that Vram would take the Yublut and use them as a tool, squandering their lives in some useless battle. As Langwind was discussing the beauty of nature around him, he said, "You really should see it during spring, and then you would fully be able to comprehend." Vram snapped his fingers, and instantly the swamp jumped from autumn into high spring. The birds were singing, the sun was bright. The naturalist was livid. "What are you doing? You're an absolute fool. Changing the environment like this could kill the inhabitants." Vram's face darkened. Planeswalkers aren't used to being talked to this way by regular mortals, but again, snapped his fingers, and the swamp returned to its natural state. But before they went any further, Vram gave Langwind a warning. "You do not speak like that to me." The naturalist nodded and took Vram on a boat tour headed deeper into the fens of Foulmere. Vram quickly grew bored of Langwind's lecturing as they sailed along, so with a quick motion, the boat was lifted magically above the treetops. Langwind was able to get his bearings from up there, and he saw where the swamp gave way to the ocean in the east, so he knew where he needed to go to settle them down in the middle of the fen. So they ended up arriving in about 10 minutes instead of multiple hours the journey would have normally taken, and also ending with a huge muck-strewn trek. They land the boat down on giant springy moss pads, but Vram won't believe that they're stable until the naturalist climbs out of the boat and starts jumping up and down on them vigorously to prove that they won't sink. Vram clumsily fell out of the boat and stood up annoyed, but his annoyance turned to awe as Langwin pointed out what he had brought the planeswalker to see. It was a massive frog over 4 meters long. It was the biggest that Vram had ever seen. The naturalist convinced Vram to hide with him so that they could view the frog in its natural environment. They crouched down in the reeds to wait. The magic that Vram had used had made the bog frog more active. Normally, its blood would be more sluggish because of the autumn weather, but that quick burst of spring had infused the frog with extra energy. It didn't take long before Vram got a demonstration of what it was capable. The naturalist pointed out a bog lemming, and out of nowhere, a marsh hawk blazed down from the sky, striking the lemming. The lemming started to shriek, and then a moment later, it was the hawk that was shrieking as the bog frog's giant tongue lashed out and wrapped around it, pulling it straight into the frog's waiting mouth. The naturalist beamed with excitement. This is what he lived for. It turned to dismay when Vram said, "I'll take it," and walked forward. Vram left his cat Mao with the naturalist and started to walk towards the giant bog frog. Vram chanted mesmerically while the frog tried to back away and whimpered, but caught in the power of the spell, had no choice but to stay stock still. By the time Vram reached the frog, it was laying meekly on the ground in subservience. Vram looked down and saw that Mao had actually run up and the cat was circling around his feet. In alarm, Vram did not want the cat this close to the big bog frog, so he picked it up and tossed it over to the naturalist. When the naturalist caught Mao, he was utterly astounded to realize that he was now holding a 5-year-old child. And at the same time, Vram had shifted too. Vram was now a beautiful woman. She had striking lavender hair. During all this chaos, the chieftain of the Ub Hlut showed up, Peft. He was very puzzled about the transformation of these two, but being the learned scholar that he was, the naturalist already knew that Vram is a Dobahim, a uniquely peculiar race of women and girls only. They have no homeland. They travel either singly or in mother-daughter pairs, rarely in adult couples, or very rarely with 2 or more daughters. The Dobahim are actually a result of a curse. Legend has it there was a cruel ancient king named Vitro, and he was so vicious that he was murdered by his own wife. To make sure that his line wouldn't carry on, she also slew his 2 sons and then fled with her daughters. Vitro then placed a curse on her from beyond the grave. Maize and lilac stain thy seed, and may it only daughters breed. His explanation was interrupted by a white-robed, golden-haired figure who suddenly appeared in the bog with them. It was instantly obvious that this was another planeswalker, and they were here to bring battle to Vram. The little girl in the naturalist's arm started to cry, and he instinctively turned away, shielding her from the sight of combat while rocking and comforting her. Both planeswalkers started to summon up different beasts to serve them, and the naturalist cried out as the bog was being damaged. Vram summoned up a mighty war mammoth, but it was too heavy for the moss, and it sunk down into the bog. The little girl in the naturalist's arms started to talk to him and explained that Vram was not actually her mother's name. It was a name she used when she planned to kill people after using them. Vram forced the newly acquired big bog frog into battle, but her opponent drew on the powers of the swamp and used terror magic to end the frog's life. The frog had left a gift for Vram, though, in the form of some mana, and unfortunately, because Vram wasn't able to use that mana, it coursed through her body, burning through her veins. Mao didn't know what was happening, so the naturalist explained to her that unused mana harms planeswalkers. Mao demonstrated that she actually understood the concept of planeswalkers. She called them trickers, and she understood the concept of mana, but to her, it was viewed as a kind of juice. The naturalist told Mao about how he thinks that all trickers are bad, and that just the nature of being one makes them think they're more important than other people, and that even the good trickers were ultimately selfish. The story then turns to the naturalist's bitter past. 40 years ago, the high mage Nimbus came to the naturalists' community of humans and elves to dazzle and help them. He destroyed a sea serpent that was terrorizing their village and did some other great feats. But ultimately, as a result of this, that made Nimbus feel like he was entitled to use the people of the naturalist community. So one by one, people started to disappear from his home. His father was the first among them. His corpse was found washed up ashore, heaped with gold and an enchanted dagger, alongside a letter praising his valor and service to the cause. After his father was gone, the naturalist became obsessed with protecting his mother. But because it could happen at any moment, he became impossibly paranoid, anxious, obsessive, and frustrated. He wouldn't leave her side. He ate almost nothing and barely slept. And then one day, the horrible moment finally came. His mother started to disappear. He could feel the shiver of unsummoning in the air, and he leapt around her in desperation, screaming for her not to go. The spell tried to shake him off and pull his mother to the planeswalker. In fact, it dislocated one of his shoulders in the process, but he refused to let go, and he found himself groggily sprawled beside his mother. His mother was dressed in the same uniform that his father had been in. They had been transported from their world into the quaking bog of Falmir. The naturalist saw the mage Nimbus. He was fighting a giant spider. He was chanting and gesturing, and he flung lightning bolts at the spider. Then the naturalist's mother was moving forward. She had her bow drawn. She was firing arrows up at the spider. The naturalist watched in horror as the giant spider reached down and picked his mother up in its giant black mandibles. He audibly heard her spine snap. The spider filled her body full of poison and tossed it aside. Back in the present day with the Planeswalker battle, the two mages are swallowed up in a giant flash of blackness and fire. Balls of flaming gas hurtle everywhere. Beasts scream, trees burst, the entire fen cooks in a gigantic explosion. The naturalist grabbed Peft and Mao and barely managed to scramble away. The naturalist, along with Peft and Mao, were far enough away from the center of this explosion that they were able to scramble up onto the shore. Mao was wailing and screaming, "Where is my mom?" The naturalist's heart broke as he hushed the child and rocked her. He told her he didn't know what happened, but deep in his heart, he did. Mao's mother was long gone, either flung to another plane of existence or more probably completely destroyed. In the aftermath of the explosion, there was one sole survivor. A single dwarf that had been summoned up was wandering around in a daze. The naturalist looked around at the fen. The devastation was complete. Peft, the Yub-Halut chieftain, wept silently. The land was mute of life and dangerous to traverse now. Smoldering fires and occasional patches of quicksand. The naturalist tried to chart a course back to his home, but he was unable to make out the landscape, and so they ultimately ended up doubling back after a long period of time. When they arrived back, night was falling, and you did not want to be in the Falmir fen at night. Unclean things would rise out of the depths. The bog now was a dry bowl of hardened peat, and the mammoth that had sunk earlier into the mire was now cooked, and the meat was so well done that the flesh was falling right off the bone. They spotted a fire in the distance, and having no other options, they headed towards it. It turned out that the fire had been made by the solitary survivor of the previous battle. He was a dwarf by the name of Ingvik. He was a metalsmith from another plane, from the city of Deep Keep. The only reason he had survived is he had come across a strange little boat in the bog, and while he was laying in there praying for survival, the boat lifted up into the air, and he realized he could control it with his thoughts. So he quickly flew it to a tree where it felt safe before the boat fell out of the sky. The naturalist was filled with hope. If he could get his hands on this boat, then they could return home safely. He asked Ingvik, and the dwarf showed him where he had left the boat, and together they pulled it down from the tree. But unfortunately, they discovered it wouldn't fly for anyone anymore. Disappointment turned to horror as the peat bog started to crack and crumble, and the denizens of the depths started to claw their way upwards, horrific ghouls pulling themselves free of the dirt. The undead moved slowly, so they set up rings of torches around the boat, and they put Mao and Peft inside of the boat. The torches proved to be somewhat helpful in defense, as a number of the undead burst into flames, trying to pass through them. Ingvik had his smith's hammer, and he used it to great effect, crushing undead skulls. The naturalist was forced to resort to a heavy club that he grabbed from a nearby tree. Peft was held in the rear with 4 special poisoned arrows that would instantly kill whoever they struck. They weren't meant for the undead. As if the overwhelming number of undead wasn't bad enough, there was even a giant undead bear. It came barreling through the torches, and it caught on fire, but that did nothing to slow it down. Ingvik ran to help the naturalist fight off the bear, but even together, they were not enough. They were backed into the inner circle right beside the boat, the undead crowding in all around them. Both Ingvik and the naturalist end up tripping backwards into the boat, backing away from the giant bear. At this point, Peft is reaching for the poison arrows. Now Mao is laying in the bottom of the boat, and when the naturalist and Ingvik fell on her, she started yelling, "Get up! Get up!" And to everyone's surprise, the boat listened to her and rose into the air. Ingvik sat up and smiled through his seared beard. Peft screamed in alarm, and Ingvik whirled around. It turned out that one of the undead had managed to hang onto the boat as it lifted into the air. So Ingvik smashed sideways into its skull with his hammer, and it fell off the boat. This caused the naturalist to almost get pitched out of the boat, but Ingvik and Peft were able to grab him by his robes and keep him on board barely. The story then returns to the naturalist's past. After that spider had killed the naturalist's mother, the naturalist actually tried to slay the planeswalker Nimbus. He crept up on him and he drove the enchanted dagger that had been left with his father's corpse straight into Nimbus's heart. Nimbus showed no reaction. He pulled the dagger out of his heart and actually complimented the naturalist, talked about how one day he too could be a mage, like a son to him. The naturalist was having none of it. Nimbus offered to send the naturalist and the corpse of his mother back to their home, but the naturalist told Nimbus to keep his dirty spells off them. "I'll bury my own mother in the bog." Saying that, the naturalist tore a brass medallion off of the chest of Nimbus and stalked off. The naturalist comes back from these memories, and him and Mao are together in the flying boat. Peft and Ingvik are having a delightful conversation where neither of them can really understand what the other is saying because they don't quite grasp each other's dialect. Mao starts to cry, saying the reason that her mother is gone is because she's a bad daughter, and she's a bad daughter because she was dabbling with mana. The naturalist assured Mao, "There's no chance that what you did had anything to do with that explosion. You are not responsible for what happened to your mom. Your mom didn't choose to abandon you. She didn't leave you here. Some other bad tricker did something to her, and she's gone now." The naturalist felt there was some kind of resonance in this situation, where in the past, a planeswalker was responsible for trying to bring him in as their child and learn the ways of magic. And now he intended to take Mao in as his child and guide her away from the path of magic, thus stopping another planeswalker from being birthed out into the multiverse. But underneath all that, more important to him was the fact that this young life was under his guardianship. He felt his resolve strengthen her tiny little breaths as she slept in his arms. She had no one else in the world to defend her, no one else to provide for her. He might not have been able to save the fen. He might not have been able to save the Yub-Plot. He might not have been able to save his own mother, but he could do this one thing. For a little while, he would be a father. All right, my friends, I hope that you enjoyed this story. It's fun to deal with something that's not quite as epic on the level of an entire multiversal invasion, and I do like these little side stories from ancient magic history. So if you like what we're doing here, you can support us by joining the channel membership or the Patreon. Big shout out to the channel's members and patrons. Thanks for coming by and hanging out with me for another story. Go watch some more fun lore videos on this channel, and in the meantime, my friends, remember, lore is life.